Thanks for having me. Nice to see you. This is going to be a hard act to follow, so I'm only a teacher, not a musician or a poet. But given what you're doing here and who you are, wives and mothers and so forth, farmers, I understand, but I've never been a farmer. I didn't know what bread was made out of until I moved to Ashland 24 years ago. I just thought, you just bought the stuff in the supermarket. I thought I'd talk about my mother a little bit, and in the following way. My mother lives in Ashland. She's 87, and by the way, if she calls, I'm going to pick it up. So, I'm not kidding. She's going to pick it up. It's the only. I tell my students that I pick up the phone if my mother calls. It doesn't matter what I'm doing. That's why I brought her to Ashland about 5 years ago. Thank God she's healthy. Well, I want to tell you a story about her that should remind you, given your theme of gratitude, that not all sons lack gratitude. And this has to do with how we came to this country. In 1956, I was 10. Just turned 10, December 23rd, 1956. We landed in the United States as refugees from Hungary, Christmas Eve, December 24th. So the first day into my 11th year in New York. We fled the Soviet occupation and invasion of Hungary, which started in October. Ended up in Hermosa Beach, California by something like January 5th, which happened to be my father's birthday. So we made our way from New York to Hermosa Beach, where I grew up on the beach, literally. I learned to swim in the Pacific Ocean, which was a little strange. And all this because of my mother's wisdom. I'll try to explain why. My father is in the story too, so I'll tell us two stories about it that I hope are engaging to you. They're true, and they, in some measure, explain why it is what I do, which is try to teach Native American women and men why they ought to love their country, and why this country merits loving. The more you know it, the more you study it, the more you study your founders and your great statesmen and your constitutional ways, the more you ought to love the country. And this is my attempt to pay you back for what good you have done me and my 4 children, who are, of course, born here. So they're just now useless Native Americans. Thank you for attempting humor. I will attempt humor again. You should laugh. My father came in. We lived in Budapest in 1956 when the revolution broke out against the Russians. And my father came charging up the stairs one day and said, "That's it. We're leaving. The revolution is going to fail." Can you guys hear me all right in the back? The revolution is going to fail, and I can't take this anymore. My father had been a political prisoner. So was his father. Persecuted by Nazis and then by communists because they were neither Nazis or communists. And life was unbearably difficult and almost hopeless, if I could put it that harshly. So my mother was ambivalent on leaving. They had 2 children. I was almost 10 and my sister was 4. We had nothing in terms of possession because my father was not employable because he wasn't a communist, so he was a window washer. And my mother sewed and ironed for people to make a few bucks, as it were. So Dad comes into the house in the midst of the revolution. By the way, the revolution meant that there were about 30,000 people died in about a week. So it was a war, basically, a short war. And he said, "We have to leave the country." And my mother said, "I don't know if I'm going to do that and leave what little possessions I have." I mean, they didn't speak English or German or anything else. They were not especially well educated. And my parents were in their early 30s at this point, mid-30s. So my mother says to my father, "I will go, we will go." My father basically said, "If you don't come with me, I'm leaving on my own. I can't do this anymore. A hand grenade fell 2 feet from him when he went out to see if he could find some food for us, and it didn't go off. That's what precipitated his charging up the stairs, and that's it. The hand grenade should have gone off. It didn't. So my mother says, we'll leave, we'll ask Peter's opinion, and if he was willing to go with you, then we'll all go. This doesn't put my mother in a good light. Bless her heart, but it worked, because they come to me and they explain briefly that your father wants to leave the country, and if your father wants to go somewhere, are you willing to go with him? And my Solomonic response was, I'm willing to go to hell with my father. Right call, good call. Of course, my father wasn't thinking of going to hell. He was thinking of coming to America, quite the opposite of hell. But I didn't know that at the time. But my next question, so the decision was made, we're leaving. And the next question was, from me, I said, where are we going? And my father said, we're going to go to America. I knew something about America, everybody did, even 10-year-olds. In 1956, in a place like Hungary. But, you know, I didn't exactly understand the meaning of that, so I said, why are we going to America? And Dad said to the 3 of us, because we were born Americans, but in the wrong place. Not bad for a window washer. I've got 4 degrees, studied on 3 continents, and it took me 40 years to understand what that meant. My father knew it, too little. Bless his heart. So we skedaddled out of the country. It took us a couple of days of crawling around in mud and so forth, literally. And we ended up on the western border of Hungary into Austria, where we escaped finally. Another interesting story. The Soviets were patrolling the place, they were killing people, and we made it. Picking up people along the way. We heard crying, haystacks. Discovered that whenever we heard that, at first we thought it was a ploy. Soviet soldiers would be pretending to be children crying, and then as soon as the Hungarian would come up, they'd arrest them or shoot them. But it turned out to be children. We picked up 6 different children that way who were crying over the bodies of their parents. So by the time we got to Austria, there were about 40 of us. And a little troop of 4. It started with 4. We ended up on a farm in Austria. They put us in a barn overnight. Slept on hay. 2 nights we were there, and then the Austrians took us to an army camp to process us. And of course, by then there were about 250,000 Hungarians that left during this period. And the country's population was about 9 million. So that's a lot of folks. So we weren't the only refugees. Others were gathered, and the Austrian army put us in a camp and fed us and so forth and so on. And processed us, as they say, took our names and addresses. We had nothing with us, by the way. My mother had a satchel with her, which I'll get back to in a minute, which included $14 in single dollar bills. And the ordinary things that a woman would carry if she has any, gold chain, wedding rings, and so forth. The $14 was gold instrument. The single dollar bills was hard to find. Any dollars, single dollars included, was hard to find as gold, and when you found them, you kept them, because they were always worth something. In a place like this that was run by tyrannies from the left and right. So they're processing us. Now my mother comes into the picture more concretely. And there are various officials from various embassies, German, Dutch, Norwegian, English, French, American, that came and visited the refugees. Now there were hundreds in these barracks. And they would meet with them and take notes and ask the refugees where they wanted to go. Because this was such a crisis that most countries had liberalized their policies and were willing to let extraordinary numbers of such people in. But they wanted to know, did you want to go to Norway, did you want to go to England, and so forth and so on. So one day a German comes by from the German embassy, West German embassy, and says, you know, your name is Schramm, which is a German name, so you're a Volkdeutsch. We'll welcome you to Germany. We'll give you a job. If you don't want a job, we'll put you on welfare. We'll give you a house. We'll give you a car, free education for your children. Come to Germany. My father said, no, thank you very much. I'm not German. I'm going to America. You know, didn't understand any of this stuff at the time. And then finally, an American comes by from the American embassy in Vienna and talks to us. And my father was sitting in, he was standing, my father was sitting in front of him. Two of us kids were behind my father, and my mother was behind us, because in those days, of course, women were, in a place like Central Europe especially, not exactly treated well. So my mother was always behind my father, playing second fiddle. So, and she didn't talk, unless someone asked her something. So the American says to my father, you want to go to America? I understand. And Dad says, yes, I would love to go to America. Do you have any relatives in America? He asks, and Dad says, no, we don't. Why do you ask that? My father says, and the American says, well, because it would be easier for you to get in, could get you in quicker. The formalities would be easier, and otherwise you'll have to wait about 6 months or 9 months even before we process you. But if you have relatives there, you can go virtually immediately. Dad said, no, I'm sorry, we don't have any relatives. And the next best thing the man said to my dad was, maybe you have some friends there, you know someone there who would be willing to sponsor you. And Dad said, no, I'm sorry, we don't know anybody in America. And you could see my dad's face, and this is too bad. My mother, without saying a word, sort of leans over, taps my father on the shoulder, then looks back up at her, and she whispers in his ear, but we do know somebody in America. Willie was his name, William. Willie, we do know someone in America. And my father looks up. This is all in Hungarian. There's a translator with the American, an interpreter, who's interpreting this for the American's sake. And my father says to my mother, what are you talking about? We don't know anybody in America. And my mother says, just a minute, I'll be right back. And she runs back to the barracks, to the bunk, gets her satchel, digs around, and pulls out from her satchel a crumpled up old business card, sort of straightens it out, puts it in front of my father. My father looks at it. He says, she's right. We do know someone in America. And the American sitting there, of course, has no idea what the heck is going on, so he says, what are you talking about? What does this mean? And he looks at the business card, which is faded, hardly legible anymore, and it said, on the business card, it said, Joseph Moser, DDS, Hermosa Beach, California. And then an address and a phone number. Remember, this is 1956. And so the American says, please explain, I don't understand what this means. You know this man? And my father says, we do. I forgot. And my mother, of course, is standing there. And so then my father tells the story of how he met this man in 1946. The war was over. Of course, a place like Hungary was absolutely devastated, run over by both, it was allied with Germany, so it was run over by Soviets after the war, the victorious Soviets, allied, of course, with the Americans. So the place was devastated. It was a horrible place. People were starving and so forth. My father, being clever and all, built himself, he didn't say it this way to the American, but this is the truth of it, he built himself a vehicle. We were living in Western Hungary in a town called Győr, where I was born, about a population of 100,000, industrial city, only about 30 miles south of Slovakia and about 30 miles east of Austria, on the road basically between Vienna and Budapest, if you can envision a map. My father had built a vehicle. There's about 4 wheels, an engine, and a flatbed kind of truck, kind of one seat, and and he'd drive around and pick up junk. You know, literally junk. I mean, tires, unexploded shells, whatever he could find, and there was a lot of it. And then he would trade that stuff, whatever he found, with other people who needed this rather than that, and they would trade. Some things he could actually sell. And that's really the way we survived for the first year after the war. I was born in December of '46, so I of course didn't participate in any of this. So in the process of doing this one day, my father continues to tell the man from the embassy, in the process of doing this one day, he notices that there's a civilian car, of which there were never any, because they were just military vehicles of various kinds. There's a civilian car, what you and I now call a Volkswagen Bug, broken down on the side of the road, and so my father notices it and goes and tries to help the man who speaks apparently 3 words of Hungarian. My father, of course, didn't speak. It turns out the man was an American officer in the United States Army, recently decommissioned in Germany. And it turns out he was born in, later we find all this out, he was born in Hungary, in Budapest. And he left there. His parents took him to the United States when he was 2. So he just wanted to go see what was left of Budapest after the war. So he got a hold of a car and was going to drive to Budapest and go drive back to Germany and then fly back to the States, having completed his military obligation, the war being over and all. So somehow some of this gets out in the 3 words that he knows, but what my father does is fixes his car for him. It took many hours, some reason I no longer understand, or maybe never did. It took many hours. And the man was grateful and wanted to give my father, and he started counting out single-dollar bills. My father is Hungarian. Hungarians have many vices, one of which is they're too proud. So my father refused the money. He was starving. His wife was starving. His parents were starving. He refused the money, which was gold, because he was too proud. And the man, sort of understanding this, finally, said in effect to him, "Here's my business card. If I can ever do anything for you, call me." Dad basically put it away, thoughtlessly, went home. Days later, not that a day, days later, my mother says, one of those questions that every wife and mother asks, how was your day today? And my father went through, the junk he picked up that day and how he was able to trade some of it and blah, 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 and so forth and so on. And then as he's sort of chattering on to his wife, he sort of says, "Oh, the darndest thing happened to me. I fixed this guy's car, and, he gave me this, I don't know what it is, and I don't know, just threw it in the trash." So my mother, when my father wasn't looking an hour later, went to the trash. This man, during these 10 years, and of course we did not, we had no communication with him at all. Just that one time. So the man from the embassy leaves, he comes back in a week. In those days it wasn't easy to place a phone call from Vienna to Hermosa Beach, California, even if you work for the embassy, right? So he comes back in a week and he says, "Absolutely amazing. I talked with this Dr. Moser, and he explains that he's a dentist," which we didn't know. Lives on Hermosa Beach, which is in California, right on the ocean. And he said he'd be delighted. He remembers you. And he's grateful for your help. He'd be delighted to sponsor you. So put us on a plane, and I grew up in Hermosa Beach, California. So if anybody ever gives you a business card, you keep the story. So I mean, isn't that interesting how life works? My mother's wisdom and prescience and prudence and judgment, I mean, maybe we would have ended up in the United States anyway, we probably would have, because hundreds of thousands of Hungarians did without knowing anybody, but it probably would have taken much longer, and I could have grown up in New York City or Cleveland. But I didn't. I grew up in Hermosa Beach, and I learned to swim in the Pacific Ocean, and went to Hollywood High School, and, not exactly the intellectual Mecca of the Western world. And you know, I went to college. My parents opened up a restaurant. 3 years after we got here, they of course did heavy labor sort of stuff. They didn't speak a word of English. My mother washed clothes and ironed and mended things for people, and my father did heavy lifting, and my mother then got a better job cleaning people's houses. And then they realized that with very little capital investment, you can actually start your own business, and no one's going to tell you not to. As my father used to say, what in part means to be an American is that if you work, you know, the people around you let you keep the fruits of your labor. Simple thing, isn't it? That's not true in tyrannies. So they had opened up a restaurant. Good banker loaned them half the money. They had the other half saved, and they spent the rest of their days until recently working in a restaurant. That's how I was able to go to college and become the useless human being I now am. One other story about my mother that's related. It's also the theme of gratitude. She's been here for 5, 6 years. About 2 years ago, she passed a school bus while the bus was stopped. She was still driving. Slowly, but, you know, she just sort of wasn't thinking. Do you know this? Do you know her? I mean, she told me about it. As soon as she did it, she said, I don't know what to do. I said, don't do anything. It's too late. You didn't hurt anybody. Thank God. Go home. Be quiet about it. That night, remember, this is a woman who was then 85 and grew up under fascism and communism, right? That night, the police officer comes to her door. She just lives just north of 42. Get it? You don't get it because you're Americans. Police officer in the evening knocking on your door. She almost fainted. And of course, he was a perfectly nice man. And said, are you Rose Schramm? Do you drive this car? Is it this color? And is this the license plate? And she went, yes, I'm guilty. She didn't sleep for a week. She had to summons to go to court. She couldn't sleep. It's all over. What am I going to do? I said, what are you talking about? She said, well, I'm going to lose my car, I'm going to lose my driver's license, and probably my house. Get it? So we go to, of course, I'm an American now, right? I don't think like Hungarians think. I don't think about living under tyrannies. I lack that experience. I think about law, not wings of judges and cops. I don't think like that. I know some judges and some cops might be bad guys occasionally or make bad decisions, but as a principle, the law rules. We go to court. I'll abbreviate this. I don't want to go on too much. We go to court. I go to court with her. Of course, she gets dressed up. We sit there for 2.5 hours watching other people. He says, who was the judge? This is 2 years ago. He just retired a year ago. Freeland. So Freeland's the judge. And everybody's curious because it's my mother, various lawyers, and half of them are Ashford scholars, you know, so they all know me. They've heard stories about my mother. And so the courtroom is, you know, sort of packed. My mother finally goes up, and of course her English is terrible, you understand. I should have explained that. She doesn't speak English. And so all the legal sort of mumbo-jumbo is especially difficult for her. So basically she can't answer any question that Freeland poses to her because she's so nervous that she can't even hear, you know. So he starts going through the ordinary questions that he'd done for everybody else, 20 people in front of us, in exactly the same way. And my mother seemed to be listening. And she said that she doesn't need my help, so I stayed in my seat. She's very independent. Bless her heart. So Freeland asked her a sensible question, and she says, I have insurance. Freeland asked her another question, and she gives, you know, some answer. She doesn't understand it, so the judge says, Dr. Schramm, would you like to interpret for me? I said, yeah. Anyway, I'll shorten the story because this is not the punchline. She got fined, nothing else happened. one of the attorneys said, look, I looked at her record, she's never had a ticket. She's never had a, you know, she's immaculately clean, you know, it's very sweet. So I can see she was taking deep breaths. You know, she was relieved, a weight had been lifted from her shoulder, we paid the fine, walked back to my car. At that time I was driving this big black Hummer, which my mother loved. She could crawl into it, you know. It's a truck. Instead of getting down, I now drive a Cadillac, and she now has to sort of go down to get into it. She doesn't like it. So we get into the Hummer, it's winter. So we sat there for a few minutes, warming the thing up. And my mother's taking these deep breaths. I can feel that she's feeling better now. She hadn't slept for a week. I'm not kidding. But you know, I'm an American, so I'm naive, so I don't really get what's going on. So I said, are you all right? Are you all right? Of course, in Hungarian. And she says, this is what she said to me. Now, here's the punchline. Listen to this. She says, I'm really glad this happened to me before I died. And you know, I mean, I have a PhD, I have a couple master's degrees. You know, I studied in England and Germany and so forth. And I'm sitting there going, what the heck is she talking about? So I said, what are you talking about, Mom? What do you mean you're happy that this happened to you before you died? She said, did you see that court? I haven't been in a court since I became a citizen in 1963. Did you see that court? And I'm thinking again, you know, my mind is running. What is she talking about? And I'm thinking she's going to criticize these other folks who went in front of us, half of whom were in their pajamas, looking, you know, stupid, dirty. You know, oh, I didn't know I was going that fast, you know. It's only my 7th beer. And I thought she was going to say, because my mother is, you know, immaculate, European, she lives in a museum, you know what I mean? She wouldn't let me sit on the couch until I was 21. She was afraid I'd soul. So I thought she was going to criticize these folks for not being respectful of the judge and this and that. You know, that's what it's a Hungarian thing to do. That's not what you, I said, so what do you mean? You're glad to see the inside of a court? She says, this reminded me of why we came to this country. Even my petty mind is beginning to click. And I said, what do you mean? She said, did you notice how the judge treated everyone as equals? And I wept. I actually wept. I said, oh my God, of course. Of course. That's why we came to this country. It doesn't matter how wealthy you were, or that your son is a professor. You're all treated the same according to the law. That's what law means. That's why we came here. And that's why she was glad that she saw the inside of a court one more time before she died. So, you know, I spent all my days teaching your children, my children, Native Americans, in other words, those who were born here and don't know anything. Why this country is, to use Lincoln's and Jefferson's phrase, both use the same phrase, last best hope on earth, and why it merits your serious affection. God bless you all. Thanks for